As we've been discussing here, this November's election very likely to be an up or down vote on how President Trump has handled this pandemic.
That's
and
right.
Not only the response here and going forward, but what happened in those crucial early days and how did the president respond at the very beginning when lives really could have been saved and economic calamity, by the way, potentially averted. There's some new potential news being reported out by the Washington Post that we wanted to bring you on that front. So according to the Washington Post, and by the way, this is a story that is sourced to the intelligence community, so always take that for what it is. We know that they have no love for this president, so let's put that out there. But according to the Washington Post, the president's briefing book repeatedly cited the virus threat. U.S. intelligence agencies issued warnings about the coronavirus in more than a dozen classified briefings, and that's really the new part, prepared for President Trump in January and February, months during which he continued to play down the threat. That's according to current and former U.S. officials, the Washington Post says. Now, why is this significant? Well, you'll recall in the very beginning, he downplayed the threat. He said it would go away in the spring. He said it's like a miracle. It's just going to disappear, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, at least according to this reporting, he was getting information about just how serious a threat this was coming out of China.
Yeah, and should note, the intelligence community, who we also should be skeptical of, said that this isn't true flatly, and they have a lengthy statement that was included in the Washington Post article. So with all that being said, who knows what's true? This is what I worried about from the very beginning. When Larry Kudlow, what we talked about on the show, talked about, I think it was early February, January, something like that, saying the virus is contained. I was like, that's it. That's, because I knew that you're going to have a John McCain, the fundamentals of the economy are strong moment.
Right.
This is also what I worried about, which is that just like that August 9th, 2001 memo that is famous now, that's been declassified, that says like bin Laden plans attacks upon the United States, the headline of the presidential daily brief that was given to George W. Bush. And people are like, how did you not know? What happened? You guys obviously knew something was happening. This is what happens is when you have a crisis situation like this, you always should err in the beginning on taking it far more seriously, because if you don't, then this is the type of stuff that could come out. Now, look, I think he shifted, at probably the exact moment whenever it would have been absolutely disastrous.
Right.
If he hadn't. His rhetoric and the actions, the shutdowns, all of that. We continue to have social distancing in this country, and I think we probably will for a long time. That's the reality. That's the only, frankly, way he saved any of his political chances. But if this is true, it's a big problem for him. And so much of the administration, people like Larry Kudlow, and there were other White House advisors who were on television who were downplaying the virus, talking about how it was contained. And there's a reason that Peter Navarro and these other people who were writing memos in early January about how this could be a global pandemic in China and all of this weren't coming out and saying such things. This is why.
Well, and it seemed pretty clear why they wanted to downplay this threat, because they were really worried about the stock market.
Yeah.
Stock market was high, and that was their first, number one priority is let's not scare people and freak people out because it'll tank the stock market. And, to a certain extent, the stock market is completely divorced from actual economic concerns. We've seen that multiple times as unemployment has struck millions of Americans and the stock market just continued to grow. But economic concerns, it's not that they're not valid, but in a pandemic situation, those two things are so tied together. You have to deal with the virus, and especially in those early days. That's part of what is so hard that we've realized with a pandemic is you have to act when it seems insane to take those sorts of measures, right? When it seems like way out of control, when nobody knows anyone who has the virus, when it seems like the spread is still so minimal, that's actually when you have to act to try to avoid loss of life. And so if this is true, and again, as you said, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, who is responsible for putting together the presidential daily briefing, they said, quote, the detail of this is not true. They declined to elaborate more, but it certainly doesn't stretch credulity that the president was receiving information about this in January, in February, as things were developing, and he continued to downplay it publicly. And even more critically than downplaying it publicly, they failed to prepare so that we were ready once we did have a pandemic on our hands here on our shores and having to shut things down and deal with, the fallout at the hospitals.
Right, and you know exactly what this leak is. This is the intelligence community be like, no, we didn't do anything wrong.
It wasn't us. We told them.
We promise. Who knows what other failures that we saw out of there in terms of the data that was coming out of Wuhan and China.
And I mean, look, it's always good to know that if you're dealing with sources that basically have an axe to grind, to factor that into the reporting. Like, I think that's always good to know. That doesn't mean that it's wrong necessarily. Sometimes you have an axe to grind and it's a legitimate story, but it's just always important to keep those pieces in mind.
Yeah, full context. I don't think it's good. And if there are congressional hearings, if there's like a coronavirus commission,
there
like
should be.
there were on 9/11,
there should be.
Then something like this comes out, it will be a problem. There's no question.
There should be. The question is whether you can have people on such a commission that would actually be trusted and not be seen as like just partisan.
Well, when Nancy Pelosi's picking every single member, and one of the people of the oversight board also is in potential violation of the Stocks Act, I think there might be an issue on that.
It's a little problematic.
Sorry.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.